For 9 chapters this substrate has bent light beautifully and lifted not a feather. Every geometry chapter built an emergent metric, watched rays curve through it, then computed the one component that says whether a clock runs slow, and found nothing. R0 equals 0. Light bends. No Newtonian force. It looked like a theory with a mirage of gravity and none of its weight. That is the case we opened today. And the resolution is not that the weight was missing. It was sitting in a room nobody had entered, the one part of the substrate that every geometry chapter, without exception, held fixed. Open that door and a real potential is standing there, doing mechanical work on massive matter, and quietly enforcing an equivalence principle that nobody tuned. One thing before we begin. Advaita Chakra Theory is a speculative, exploratory framework, not established, peer-reviewed physics. Much of what follows is honest conjecture that still needs validation. Watch it in that spirit as ideas to test, argue with, and refute. Start with the substrate's own Lagrangian, with the couplings now allowed to vary slowly from place to place, which is the only regime where a gravitational potential even means anything. 3 terms: a time derivative term carrying the inertia I, a gradient term carrying the stiffness J, and an on-site term carrying the locking Hessian script M, whose exact null direction is the Goldstone mode of the lock ground state. Now look at where the 2 knobs sit, because the whole case turns on keeping them apart. The stiffness sits in the gradient term, and it fixes the light cone. The effective speed squared equals A0 squared times J over I. The locking sits in the mass term, and it fixes the gap. Chapters 5 through 9 turned the first knob, and only the first. They varied stiffness, computed a metric, and never once touched the locking. Hold that thought. The lapse, it turns out, lives in the second. Project the field onto the Goldstone direction, the uniform mode, and the mass term dies, because the locking Hessian annihilates it exactly. This is a massless single scalar with 2 position-dependent kinetic densities, one for time, one for space. Now the proposition, and it is the hinge of the whole chapter. A kinetic tensor of that form determines the emergent metric only up to a conformal factor. It fixes the ratio of the space part to the time part, that is, the light cone, and leaves an overall function completely free, which means you may always choose the representative in which the lapse is exactly 1, and in that representative R0 is 0, identically. So the recurring result of chapters 7 through 9 is not the absence of gravity. It is a choice of gauge. A massless field has no rest frequency and no proper clock, so it is constitutionally unable to tell a fast region from a slow one. This part is standard physics, the conformal invariance of a massless scalar. Finally read correctly. The witness could not have seen the crime, so find a witness that carries a clock. Take any gapped mode, an eigenvector of the locking Hessian, with locking MSCI and inertia IC. Read its dispersion straight off the Lagrangian, in the lab, with no metric choice to make omega squared equals the effective speed squared times k squared, plus omega naught squared. And omega naught squared is MSA divided by IC, an eigenvalue of inertia inverse times the locking Hessian. That is precisely the ACT mass gap. Here is why it breaks the deadlock. The mass term is not conformally invariant, so omega naught is not a gauge choice. It is a ratio of 2 laboratory quantities, directly measurable, and it means something. Where omega naught is large, a massive particle's rest oscillation runs fast. Where it is small, that clock runs slow. A spatially varying rest frequency is precisely what gravitational redshift is, and a redshift gradient, as we are about to see, is a force. Now do the mechanics. Treat the gapped mode as a wave packet and use ray theory. The substrate is static, so the frequency is conserved along the ray, and Hamilton's equations give you the velocity and the force on the wave vector. Take the slow limit, effective speed times k much less than omega naught, and expand the conserved energy. It splits into 2 pieces you will recognize immediately. H bar times omega naught at that position, plus p squared over 2m, with the mass being h bar omega naught over c squared. The second piece is kinetic energy. The first is a position-dependent rest energy, which is to say a potential. Take its gradient and you have a force minus mc squared times the gradient of the logarithm of omega naught. Now impose the Newtonian correspondence and the lapse falls straight out. The potential phi equals the change in the logarithm of omega naught, which is 1/2 the change in the logarithm of script m over I, derived. That is the headline of the chapter. A gradient in the gap does mechanical work on massive matter. Claims are cheap. Integrate it. Model a local overdensity in the locking sector as a Gaussian bump in the gap, a hill in omega naught squared. In the code's dimensionless units, the barrier height is 0.15. Launch a slow particle with wave vector 0.3, which gives it a launch kinetic energy of 0.045. 3 times too little to climb the hill. Integrate the ray equations and 2 things happen. The conserved frequency holds to 2 parts in 100,000 across the whole flight, so the integrator is honest, and the particle climbs, halts, and comes back. It reflects a test mass turning around on a potential hill, not a bookkeeping artifact. Then the control. Feed the identical profile to a massless ray, with omega naught set to 0. It sails straight through. Refracted, never reflected, because it reads only the cone, and the cone was held fixed. 1 profile, 2 verdicts, force for matter, transparency for light. That is the 2-sector split seen in a single run. Now the objection at full strength. If the cone and the clock are 2 independent knobs, then light bending and matter force are 2 independent numbers. In general relativity, they are welded together by the equivalence principle. Light bends by exactly twice the Newtonian potential. The post-Newtonian parameter gamma equals 1. Cassini measured gamma minus 1 to be smaller than 2.3 times 10 to the minus 5. So the 2 ACT channels must track each other to 5 decimal places, and the original calculation admitted, in its own words, no a priori reason why they should. A fine-tuning at the 10 to the minus 5 is a mortal wound. The repair is structural, not numerical. Both couplings are functionals of 1 condensate amplitude, and the same power of it. The stiffness goes as amplitude squared, that is the standard superfluid helicity modulus. The locking goes as amplitude squared to the standard Higgs-type gap, and an ordinary energy source has exactly 1 handle on a 1-order parameter medium. It depresses the amplitude, so both move together to all orders. Gamma equals 1 is protected, not tuned. Gap 3, closed. Verdict. The gravity arc, chapters 5 through 10, closes here. The lapse exists, it is derived, and it lives in the inertia and locking sector, a knob orthogonal to the stiffness that 9 chapters spent their time turning. R0 equals 0 was never the absence of gravity, it was the massless sector being asked a question it constitutionally cannot answer. And the equivalence principle comes out emergent rather than imposed, 1 condensate amplitude underneath both channels, so the cone and the clock have no choice but to move together. Now what is not claimed? This is a kinematic result at the test particle level. It says that a gap gradient exerts a force. It does not say what creates the gap gradient. If ordinary energy density is the only thing that can, then this is standard gravity with no shortcut. That question is open, sharply posed, and deferred. Next, the series turns from what the substrate does to geometry to what else the substrate can be made to do, whether these couplings can be driven, rather than merely deduced. A word of acknowledgement. This work was inspired in part by the non-dual teachings of Sri Narayana Guru, that the creator, the creation, and the substance of creation are fundamentally one. Symbols from the Hindu tradition, the Sudarshan chakra and the Shivalinga, suggested the analogies behind the chakra model. They are acknowledged as philosophical and symbolic inspiration. The physics stands on its own. Thank you for watching. If this made you think, the book and the next chapter are linked below. Until then, one substance and how far it reaches.